Friday again. It comes so soon. We've had a holiday here in the UK last weekend. Amanda and I just discussing what we've been up to. Hope you managed to take some time off and spend it with family or loved ones. We certainly managed to. But we're happy to be here again on Friday, 10 a.m, live across LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. But you can also catch us on your podcast of choice, podcast host of choice, in your own time. And you can also watch us on Catch Up by any of those channels as well. So please do say hello. But we're just going to get right into the key topics of the week. Today, we're going to discuss maybe the interview process, senior women moving out of key roles in organizations that they've worked very hard to get to. And I would say where we want them to stay, obviously not negatively impacting on their own mental health and well-being, but that's what we need to rectify. And just some of the more broader topics that have come out of this week's posts, especially Amanda's newsletter, and some of the other posts that she's put, and some posts that I've put that have got some responses that I'm fascinated about, actually within my own family network. So, Amanda, would you just like maybe to talk to us about some of the topics that have come out of your post this week? Because they've gained some good interest, and I love the stats and data that you've been sharing to back them up.
Great. So I think one of the things that's coming out, and it seems to be sort of going around a bit and having a bit of a buzz over the last 24 hours, is, again, I did a newsletter a couple of weeks ago about leaving talented individuals, especially females, leaving their jobs, quietly quitting their jobs when they've got, because of ND children, they're trying to manage, they are, I think I put it in one of the bits, a carer and a career. Often your caring duties and your career duties combine to you're at the peak of your career and you're needing to really escalate and show your performance. At the same time, you're probably at the peak of your caring bit where you're caring for your teenagers, or you might be caring for parents as well. And I think one of the things I talked about this week very much in the newsletter was about our need to be flexible and what that actually means. So that if we're going to keep talent and really good talent and allow people to progress in the workplace, we've got to really challenge what hybrid working means. And I think that's one thing that's coming up again and again that I'm hearing people saying, well, there's this push to get everybody back in the workplace and we've got to see you. If we can't see you, we don't know you're working, even though we've been working from home the last few years. Not everybody, because not everybody can work from home or should or need to work from home. But for some people, that ability to work from home allows you to take a job and keep a job. And I think we've got to really challenge, what does this really mean if we're going to be optimizing and maintaining the talent that's out there, and seeing neurodivergent parents, not just women. I'm not just saying it's just women, but women do the proportionate amount of the caring duties, above and below. So caring for parents, caring for kids. But I think we've got to challenge hybrid, what this means.
Yeah, and I think if we look at what's going on at the moment, this is not just like people in organizations doing, I don't know, traditional roles, whatever it may be. We're seeing the YouTube CEO stepping away from the role. We've seen key global figures, prime ministers, presidents.
Jacinda Ardern stepping down. She got children. You can't do it all. And what talent? How are we losing so much talent because of that? And abilities. And you just go, why? And you think about the construction of say board meetings, often happen at a certain time of day. Now they've got to be face to face. Well, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, if you've got kids coming home from school, you may need to be there to help them, support them. Does it have to be in person in London, where you've then got an hour's commute to get home? I think we've just got to be a little bit more mindful of people's lives, really, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Annie's saying, where is the trust if they need to see you to know you're working? It's ridiculous given how we saw productivity often rise without the workplace distractions and pointless meetings pre-COVID. Toxic culture too. I think also in relation to this point, it's what tends to happen in organizations, from what I see, is there may be somebody who's disconnected from their role, right? And there may be a number of reasons why they're disconnected from their role. They've been given lack of support, lack of care, lack of consideration. They've not been developed, invested in. The role has shifted away from them, and they've not been carried with it. Like, there's all these different factors why somebody can be disconnected from that job. What I often see is there's a number of reasons why that's not dealt with. Fear, the managers being too busy to offer the support. There may be poor excuses, right? But I see these happening.
They're real excuses. They're real excuses.
Exactly.
If managers are under pressure, it can be really hard if they've got their own things they've got to do. Then sometimes genuinely it's not a lack of interest, it's a lack of time and the pressure on themselves as individuals as well. So it goes all the way through an organization, doesn't it? I don't think it is one mistake. It's often lots of drops in the bucket that accumulate and then overflow. And that's what I'm hearing with the women in some of these high, but they just go, I've had enough, and they really, their mental health is being affected. They feel burnt out and just say it's not worth it, and then we've lost them. That's the big thing. We've lost them. And will they come back in? Because I think you lose confidence very quickly as well, and you start going, I'm not capable. It's me. It's got to be me.
So I think in relation to that, let's say that person or people who have become disconnected, and often sometimes I think they may be ND, right? They may be autistic or dyslexic, and therefore they found it difficult to maintain a piece of work, a standard, the shift in work. And because they've not been carried along, they then become distracted possibly and focused on other stuff, which has an impact on the team and performance and everything else. That individual doesn't want to be that person, right? But by nature of what's going on in that environment, they've become that person, and that then becomes a challenge. And I think the problem is then the organization focuses on possibly that individual, and therefore everybody has to then come into work because they've not given the time and energy to support the individual. It's at the cost of we don't know what to do, so you're all going to have to come back into work so we can micromanage you or see you, because maybe we're not going to micromanage you, we're not got the time. So the best we can do is see you, and at least then we can call you out and go, you're not working. But where was the help? Where was the support? Where was the ability to take this person who's really struggling and not put it on the team and say, oh, you, the team, need to help this? But no, like leadership, it comes from the top, it comes down. I see and hear this so often. And then the decisions that are made about bringing people back into the workplace that negatively, disproportionately affect people who are disabled or parents or women, it's just not good enough.
And I think the other thing is, it is about neurodiversity, but it's also about people, right? And our lives change. So if you are wanting people to stay and retain people, is that we become parents, we become carers, we become ill. There are lots of things that happen in our lives. We can have a visual impairment, we can have a stroke. There's lots of things that happen during our work lives. And if we're wanting to keep people in work for longer, which seems like we're going to have to be and work forever, then we've got to recognize 50% of 50-year-olds have some hearing impairment, right? So working in this way and having a virtual environment might be a much easier way to have a conversation with closed captioning for somebody who's got a hearing impairment, might enable them to stay in a busy team, whereas actually being in an office with lots of noise around might be really difficult for that person to continue to work. So you lose them. And I think that's the conversation we really need to have. And I think somebody put in, MR said, how do we help employers understand neurodiversity in the workplace? I think we need to say it's about talent attraction, it's about talent performance, it's about optimization, it's about retention, it's about well-being, and it's about productivity. And that's a conversation that most organizations will go, okay, because we need to get people in and we need to keep people. And it costs a hell of a lot to recruit people, and train them. So why wouldn't you want to keep the people and get the right people in?
Absolutely. So I think retention's huge. But what I also say is you've already got possibly more people coming through your recruitment process than you have in employment. So I'm a massive advocate for retention, and I think there's potentially 10 to 20% of your workforce who you could keep them and make them perform at their optimum. They want to. They don't want to not be performing well. It's not good for anyone. That doesn't make you feel good going home and feeling like I failed today. Nobody wants that. You join an organization at the beginning because you believe in it, you buy into its ethos, or you desperately need work. But either way, there is a massive motivating factor to why you're in that workplace. It's something happens along the way where that breaks down. So retention is such an important area that they miss out on. But I also think here, this is my sister, right? I did a post, and this was a challenge with not just my sister, but with my mum throughout her history. My mum was a social worker and worked with children in social care services in really desperate situations. So highly stressful, highly challenging. She never, ever got out of that work, even though it had a massive negative detrimental impact on her mental health and well-being, because she couldn't interview, because she had stress and anxiety as part of the interview process to such a great extent. Even when people told her, you've got to go for this job, you're the best person for this job, they were sat on the panel and afterwards would go, well, we still can't give you the job because you didn't tick the boxes. So even though we know you're the best person for the job, you're not getting the job. And therefore she was stuck in a cycle of being in the same role within those very challenging shifts. Now, I'm concerned how many people, not just in the ND community, how many people who are struggling, who could be providing a great service to the world, to business, to organizations, but only ever end up in what is the most difficult of situations, the most difficult of roles, the most difficult of organizations. Those people could end up falling off the edge of a cliff in many different ways. My sister made a great point that not only was it stressful, but it actually triggered migraines, which I'm fascinated by, because I've been having a conversation with my wife today, who also gets migraines, and about it's not just triggering, and you do, man, it's not just triggering the migraine, but it's also the fear that comes with a migraine being triggered by a situation. So, and again, I don't know the ratio in terms of how that impacts women v men, but you start to see again, this is another barrier.
There is. So we know that, for instance, ADHD, people who have ADHD, for example, have a higher risk of migraines. Okay, so that's one thing. We know that anxiety can provoke somebody having migraines, and we know that some women at different times of the month can have an increased risk of having migrainous attacks. And it is, I actually had a migraine in the middle of a webinar a couple of weeks ago. I had a pre-migraine. So I get flashing lights and my visual
aura. My wife does. Visual aura.
I had a visual aura. So my slides just had this sort of thing in front of them the whole time. And I was thinking, oh, I've got 10 minutes to go and I've got to keep going because I can't just suddenly stop, which obviously didn't help particularly, because if you can stop quickly, I find that I can limit that a little bit. So it goes back to anxiety, right? And putting yourself in the shoes of people coming through. What does it feel like traveling to somewhere you've never been before, meeting people you've never met before, not knowing what's going to happen when you get there, you know? And I was just talking to somebody just before this, and they said they went to an interview and they were asked, you're going on holiday next weekend. Should you take a roll along or a soft bag? That was his interview question. He wasn't working for EasyJet, okay? Not that I'm promoting any airlines particularly. But it was just like, why? And he asked afterwards, why is that in there? And they said, well, it was in the interview pack, so we needed to ask it. And you just have to go, what does that mean? You know? So we got to question much more. So Annie's saying, what recruitment to, from an autistic ADHD was told she didn't get the job because she couldn't answer the interview questions efficiently enough with solid structure. Well, what does that mean? What is solid structure? What do you want to do? So build Lego bricks and present it in that sort of form? I mean, and jargon, you know, so often I think we have these biases that we're expecting in an interview for people to answer quickly, you know, come up with the answers straight away. And if you have to do which often a lot of us do, especially when you're anxious and you need longer to process because you might have a processing challenge, we judge people so quickly on that, you know, and when it may not. I would prefer to have somebody reflective who's going to do the job and think about it that somebody who's just coming up with an answer because they feel like they've got to make it really quickly because that's the expectation of the person in front of you.
Exactly. And I think but that's the problem, isn't it? Getting organizations to come back to the point around how you get them to consider neurodiversity. That is one of the challenges, is getting them really to see things differently. And I think the things that often help them see the difference that they can make is some of the stats you shared in your newsletter, for example. Getting onboarding right. So, right, even if somebody does manage to get over the interview process, what then happens is they got through the interview. In my sister's point, the only job she ever got in teaching was because they provided the interview questions up front, right? So imagine they do that and you get the job, but then your onboarding is terrible, which means even though you've got the job, you walk in and you can never access the role properly in a way that other people can. Therefore, you fail. And you put, 69% of employees who go through a well-managed onboarding process have a more positive view of their work environment and will stay with their company for at least 3 years. SHRM data and insight there. And I just think that is just so, and we're not then saying about an autistic employee dyslexic. We're just saying have a really robust onboarding process, but consider the needs of different individuals. And then you're going to really make an impactful change to retention, which is your point, because the people dropping out, that's it's not long-term retention. I think there was something else around, there was a percentage stay more than 3 years as well. Those are important figures. They stay more than 3 years, and 79% of employees go through a well-managed onboarding process, have a more positive view of the working environment. I mean, those stats are powerful, right?
They really are. And I think, onboarding, it starts with explaining what you're expecting for that person to do, right? And I know that sounds so simple, but actually sometimes we don't explain the rules of the workplace and the expectation. And I often talk about sort of non-work rules. It's the tea wars, right? So can you make a cup of tea? When if you make a cup of tea, do you have to make it for everybody else? Whose mugs? Do you have your own mugs? I've seen this so many times where we haven't talked about the unwritten rules. Can you bring your sandwich to the desk? Should you go and have a coffee break? And everybody seems to know how to behave, and you don't know what's expected. And that can cause so much anxiety. Or just how you communicate. Different organizations, some will use Slack, Skype, Teams, and some people will they drop me a line anytime you like and we'll just pick it up. Other people go, no, we have a certain time when we come in and engage every morning, whatever the processes are. It's a bit like we're going to somebody else's home, how you sit down and have a meal and what the rules are varies hugely in one family to another. Well, organizations are a bit like families. There are lots of unwritten rules about, can you stay at your desk? Can you leave your desk? Do you take a break? Don't you take a break? If I got a question, how do I ask? Who do I ask? And those things all add up to, I feel really uncertain. And I was talking to somebody who left a job recently because there was hot desking, and it was too worrying because every time they went into work, they just didn't know where they were going to sit, who they were going to sit next to, whether it was going to be noisy or not, whether they would actually have a desk by the time they got there in the morning. If they were a little bit late, it might be on another floor next to not in even with their team. And then in the end, they went, it's too much. And they left.
And you know what? The thing is, I would be fascinated if they did a survey to ask who minds moving around desk, not should we do it or shouldn't we do it? Because that might be a different response where 99% of people say no, don't do hot desking. Whereas there's a cost, right? So thinking from a business perspective, they've got 100 people in a room, and then they're giving flexible working, and 100 people are never going to be in the room because of the level of flexibility. They're not going to have 100 tables, right? That's the reality, because it doesn't make business sense. And that money could be invested in better technology and flexibility and nice lunches or whatever else. However, have they asked the question of who minds, who would be okay with it? Like me, it's a little bit, but I can be okay. Just give me somewhere to work and I'll be all right. Right?
Yeah.
So on a scale, like if you're picking me or someone else, give it to someone else. There are some people who I know, like you mentioned, who every single morning they're rushing to get into work earlier than they need to get that desk, just to sit in a seat to know they've got. That is wrong. That is
I
wrong.
know, it's really wrong. And this guy was sort of going, sometimes he was on another floor and he was away and he didn't know sort of, where coffee was or what to do, or then he was unfamiliar. He wasn't near his team anyway. So then you go, well, you'll be better working from home in that instance. Because actually, if you're not near other people you're working with, what's the advantage of being somewhere away from the people you're working with? You might as well be virtually working as a team, right? So I think you're right. That scale, it's an interesting. I might put a poll out at the weekend then, Theo, and ask people.
Great. Do. And I think
it's an interesting one, really.
Sometimes it's the way that we ask the questions, and so I'm trying to think about it, because you can ask, are you this side or that side, and it can give you a skewed view, because we may all think we're that side, but when it comes down to, is it life critical for us? Is it is it so important that it's going to have an impact on our mental health and well-being? They're the types of questions that we need to ask so that we can understand. Okay, because otherwise we as organizations, we as individuals, as teams think, well, everybody needs the flexibility, therefore, or they need to know where they're going to sit, therefore we can't provide it, rather than most people are all right with it, but these three people, it's having a massive negative impact on their ability to do their job. Then everybody else needs to be more mindful and say, okay, well, we'll take the chin on this one, because we know there'll be flexibility in other areas when we really need it.
Yeah, and I think it just also depends on the sort of tasks you're doing. So you might be okay to do hot desking one day because you've got a whole thing and you can put your headphones on and do that. But another day it might be you need to be with your team together. Sometimes you might need to be home because you need to be able to stand up and move around, or you need to have access to a standing desk. So actually, again, it's that flexibility of thinking, not only about the individual, but the tasks and where is the best environment for you to thrive, right? And those things will change. That goes back to the beginning bit of the conversation, really, which is over time and in different situations, our needs will change. And having some of that flexibility to go, yeah, at the moment I'm fine. If I can come in 3 days a week, 4 days a week, or whatever it is. But, in a couple of months' time, my mum's going into hospital, and I just need to be around. Okay, fine, And it's a challenge. It's not easy. But what we did show in COVID, that we change things overnight. So when people say you can't do something, we can no longer say that. We can't. And I think we shouldn't be going back to where we were. We've got to go, what do we learn?
And let me give you a great example of that. When COVID hit, I was working for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, heading up their recruitment. And not only did we go home when we were predominantly in an in-office organization, there was some flexibility, but it tended to have a seniority mix to it. So you were, if you were lower down the pegging order, you generally didn't get as much flexibility, or depending on the work you did, dependent on the level of flexibility you got, which is common across lots of organizations, right? But what was fascinating is overnight that completely changed. But what was more interesting for me was the work that we produced, which was very, very important work, the evidence-based guidance that goes into the healthcare sector. So it's many, many years. They adapted that guidance into rapid guidance for COVID. So because by nature of the work that they did, you can't rush a piece of evidence-based research. It has to take 2, 3, 4 years. All of a sudden, they had to, prioritize quicker research, because we couldn't sit around waiting for COVID. So it just goes to show that the impact of COVID was not just in the flexibility of the work and the workplace and the environment and the employees. And by the way, they're a very good employer in terms of lots of the stuff that they offer, but can be rigid like many other organizations and public organizations in other areas. But overnight, that COVID thing didn't just impact how employees turned up or didn't turn up to work, but also the actual fundamental mechanics of the work they produced, which I know to be true across many different industries and organizations. And we need to embrace that more, right? And it's not go back and say, okay, well, now we forget all the wonderful things that happened that allowed us to move with such freedom and fluidity, but not discounting that, a level of intense research is important, for example, or.
it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, really, isn't it? Really, in the sense of, I just remember in the early days of COVID, we had everybody going, "You're on mute. You're on mute." That was sort of like the chorus of every meeting. People didn't know how to use chat. I did some training on how to, for an organisation, how to use Zoom. So we do virtual. So we've changed a lot in terms of the opportunity to do virtual hiring, the opportunity to do group working. I think a lot of people feel more confident about technology and the communication, different ways we can communicate in this sort of way, like we're doing now, right? It just is so easy that we wouldn't be able to do this. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation unless we had the facility to do so. So I think we've got to move and go, what have we learned that we can apply? And I think when somebody was saying about, we need to be thinking about high up in organizations, right? We need more neurodivergent leaders. And he's saying, implementing these changes. I think that's right. If we're going to get talent up the career ladder, then we've got to make sure that we're thinking about our operations, how we meet, when we meet, where we meet, and could we do it differently? I always think our board meetings boring, the sort of play on words, but do we have a structure because the way it's been, because that's the way it's been? It's a bit like terms and conditions. Do we have to have 27-page T's and C's because that's the way they've been? Could we change things now and go, actually, if we did it in this way, we would include other people, and then more people might progress up into senior leadership positions? Who are we excluding by our practices?
Yeah, exactly. And, office design is integral to retention. It's universal design principles that you talk a lot about that need to be considered. And I mean, one great example was one that we included in the book was the BBC in Cardiff. I mean, COVID hit, where the neurodiversity was at kind of the center of the design of that new building. It wasn't kind of plugged in afterwards. It was part of the overall thinking around the color of flooring and the textures and the feelings and the way certain areas were designed and the level of flexibility. I mean, it's a pity that COVID hit after that building was designed, it almost, because, or that building wasn't designed after COVID, because would it be designed differently? I imagine possibly it may be.
We've got BSI guidelines that came out in October last year, the first PAS guidelines for neurodiversity and working spaces and places. So everybody should have a look at those as well, because they were published, they will be reviewed, and they took a couple of years to put together. And they're the first guidelines for thinking about the working environments and what we need to do, and the living environments, because it is things like way markers, how do you find your way to somewhere? How do you find your way back to somewhere? And that's important for everybody in work, but anybody coming in or customers coming that might be neurodivergent as well. How do we think about so Catherine's point about office design I think is really important. Our design but all the things that come before the office as well, I think is really important.
Absolutely. And there's something that came out, the research, another bit of research that you shared that I liked, which comes back to what you were saying earlier, which is communications. I guess it's a nice way to round today's discussion off, but communication is so important. And you put regular feedback sessions can dramatically reduce employee turnover. Companies that implement regular employee feedback have 15% lower turnover rates than companies that don't give employees consistent feedback. Now, I know this well because of my poor working memory, right? If you don't don't tell me off like too long after the event, because I won't remember it, right? You need to deal with me at the point that this thing's happened, because I move on very quickly, and that can be useful. Yeah. But also then I can't remember what happened, so then I don't learn from it. So if we think about that in terms of some of the challenging conversations, they need to happen as quickly as possible to support the individual. But then you need to offer help and support and guidance to allow somebody to move. And this is why the work you do with the Do It profile is so profoundly important to people being able to understand their strengths and challenges, because that overlap for me was the most you need to take control of the communication as well, right, as an individual. And I didn't know how to take control of the communication. It felt always enforced upon me rather than a two-way dialogue, and it was always in areas of difficulty.
So I think, I think the communication piece, communication and regular check-ins, they come up again and again. What really helps you? What makes a difference? And actually, regular communication, regular check-ins allows for clarification. So I'm not sure quite what you've said. I need to check in with you whether what I've interpreted is right. That keeps people in jobs, right? So I think that's the big thing here. So yeah, communication is the heart of this, and I think that's where we need to begin and end this podcast, really, because I think that helps by understanding each other better. We will, whatever stage of career, and also at the recruitment onboarding phase, when we listen respectfully and with kindness, we will make a big difference, I think, really.
Absolutely brilliant. So thank you, everybody, for joining us again today. We're going to go again next week. We're really going to focus now on key topics every week and start to bring people in to have those conversations. Amanda and I are going to map that out so that we can start. We may do some moving around, but if we can start to get to grips with what the next 5 weeks will look like, then you can choose to come along and get involved with those that take your interest. Pass it on to people within your network who may want to come and join the debate. Or by all means, just keep joining us on a weekly basis, because we love
tell us what you want. Tell us what you want as well.
I mean, this is a sharing, caring space. And come and join. If you've not, come and join the Neurodiversity-TEA Time group that you can find on LinkedIn, because we're starting to get members joining and having conversations there as well, which would be lovely.
Brilliant. Thank you, everybody.
Have a great week.